And in this video, we're just going to go through how we can create tables and form foreign key and primary key relationships between the tables so that we can maintain what's called data integrity, so that SQL Server can check whether the data that we're inputting is actually the correct data, and if it's not, to throw up some errors. So how do we do that? In the previous videos, so in the first video we downloaded SQL Server Management Studio and the SQL Server, and in this video we're using Management Studios. So if you haven't already created a database, you should go to part 1 of this video series. So in this scenario, I've got a database which I've called MyDB. So if we expand that, we don't actually have any tables. So if we expand tables, we've got none at all. So how do we create a table? Well, as usual, there's always two ways in creating it with SQL Server. So it's either through the GUI or the graphical interface using SSMS, or we can create it through a script. So we'll do both in this scenario. So if we right click on tables and go to new, under tables, click on tables, it'll open up a new graphical interface window here. Now, what do we want to create? We want to create two tables. So one being here, we're going to create two tables, one a customer table with some values and a gender table with some values as well. So the relationship that we're going to try and form between these two tables is a foreign key on one table, which is the gender, and a primary key on the gender table. What is a primary key? A primary key is a unique ID for each individual row. Consider it as like your bank card number. It's unique to that particular row, and it normally just increments by 1. It's 1, 2, 3, and so on. So this table has an ID, and each table can only have one primary key. So in the customers table, the ID column is the primary key, as we can see. And then in the genders table, the ID is also the primary key. But we're forming a relationship between the two tables. The gender ID becomes the foreign key in this scenario here, but we'll come on to how that works in later down the line. So how do we create that table? We need the columns. So what columns do we need? We need ID, obviously, for the primary key. What data type does that need to be? It needs to be a number, a whole number, so we call that integer. So we will look down at int. Here you go. Do we want nulls? No, we don't want any null values, because we want every single row to actually have a value. So we uncheck this. The next column that we want is the name. So we'll add the name, and then what data type is that? It's going to be a text, because it's going to be a name like Mohammed, Ali, Sarah, and so on. So we select nvarchar and pay attention to that bracket number inside. It says 50. 50 is the number of characters we want to accept within the name column. So if somebody has a really long name that has 56 characters, it will not be inserted into that table. It will throw up a violation. So we can increase that number to 100 or so on. So if we have a particular description column that needs 200 range, we can add that into the table, either on creation, but we can also update it later down the line. So in this scenario, we're going to use nvarchar, which is a text data type, and we're just going to keep it 50 characters. I've not known anyone who's got a 50 character name or above, but I stand to be corrected if that's the case. Do we want values to be null? So can we accept somebody with no name? No, we can't. So we have to uncheck this as well. We do not want any null values in this column as well. Okay, so the third one that we're going to do is email. So we're collecting email. So email, and then again we're applying the same principles, nvarchar 50, and we also want to definitely collect the email address, so we uncheck that. And then the last one, which is the foreign key that we're going to apply, is the gender ID, which will reference the gender table. We want this to be an integer because it's a number on the other side. Now, this is where it's interesting. Can this be null? Yes, it can, because somebody might enter a gender, but they don't really want to provide it. So we can have it as unknown. It's entirely up to them and optional. So this is the first table. Pay attention to the top of this query window. It says DBO table 1. We don't want it DBO table 1. We want it to say customer table. So how do we do that? We right click on the top Can you see where it says save table _1? We click on that, and then now we enter what do we want the table to be called. So in this instance, we're calling it customer. Okay, and then we click OK. And then if we pay attention here, if we refresh this, this will now appear on the table here, DBO customer. So that's there. Perfect. Now the next one that we want to create is the gender table, but rather than using the graphical interface, we're going to create this using a script. So how do we do that? We do create table, and then what table do we want to create? We want to create the genders table, and then in brackets we can have the definitions. So we want the ID column, we want that to be integer, which is the data type. We don't want it to be null because we want to have a value for every single one of those rows, and we want to set this to be a primary key. Okay, primary key. Now what was the next column? We wanted to have the gender, and then this one here we want it to be an nvarchar, and then number of characters we want 50, same again, and then here we don't want to be null, not null, and then that's it. So now we're going to create this. Just make sure that we've got the right database context selected, because if we don't have the right one, in this instance we do, but I'm going to show you very quickly if you can, you know, how obvious mistakes are actually done when it comes to scripting here. So now I've switched it on purpose, switched the context to master. I will run this. It says object already exists because we've already created it. So if we go to the system database and then we go to master and we go under tables, here we have gender. So it's been created in the wrong place. We don't want that to happen. So we need to make sure that we have the correct database selected. So if we now select my DB and then close that system one, and then under here, now if I run this under this context, it will say command completed successfully. So now if I refresh this, we will see the gender table now. So both tables are created. Okay, so now what do we want to do? We want to add some data. So here, let's just go to right click on the customers table, and then we say edit top 200 rows. It'll open up another window. What do we want to do? We want to just add some dummy values in there. So if I say ID of 1, name of Ali, and then email address, let's just say ali@ali.com, and then gender, what do we want the gender to be? So Ali's a male, so we know the gender is number 1. Okay, now the second one, we're just going to add another dummy value. So here, let's just say Sam. Okay, and then we'll go, okay, sam@gm.com. okay, now here we only got 2 genders, right? A third one is unknown, right? But here, if I add, say, 55 as a gender, this will accept it, but it's obviously an error. We don't actually have a gender ID of 55 that relates to the gender table. So this here, we don't actually have a link between the 2 tables. We don't have a link yet, a foreign key and a primary key connection between the customer table and the gender table. And this will cause issues down the line if people will put in any other random value and SQL Server is not checking the integrity of the data. We can get real messy data. And this is where foreign key and a primary key constraint, a constraint is what we need to create to be able to link these 2 tables and make sure that we putting in the correct values, is where it's actually important and imperative. Now, how do we do that? I'm going to sort of delete this row here and I will say null. Okay, and then here, let's go. And then let's close this and go right. So if we go to the customers table and then we say design, and then in the design, we want to right click on any of the primary keys or the keys that we want, and we go down to relationships. This is where we're trying to create the relationship. So click on relationships, and then here we have open up a new window where it says foreign key relationships. We need to add a new one if we don't have one already. So if we click add, it will just create a name for us. So FK basically meaning it's trying to create a foreign key constraint. And then at the top here where it says tables and column specification, there's a 3 dots ellipsis on the right hand side. So if we click on that, this is a new table window that we open up. What are we trying to do here and what are we trying to achieve? We are trying to determine the primary key on one table. So what is the primary key on the first table? It's not the customers table, because that's where the foreign key actually lives. So we need to change this to say, right, the genders table is where the foreign key ID is. And then we want it to reference. What do we want? So in the primary key table, we want to go down to this section just below it. In the down, we click down and then we see the gender and ID. So these are coming from the genders table. We want the primary key to be the ID from the genders table. So genders table and ID. What do we want it to reference? So the foreign key on the other table is the customers table. So now we have to click on the down arrow again so that we can reference the two together. What are we referencing? The gender ID. Remember in the actual diagram picture that I had, I'm going to bring that up again. We have the gender ID on the customers table that needs to reference the ID column from the gender. So that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to create the primary key from one table to a foreign key to the other side. So this is the gender ID. So if we click on that and then we click OK, that creates that constraints. We're not going to do that here. We're just trying to understand how we can do it through the graphical interface. But what we will do is actually create it using a script. So when we cancel out of that, cancel out of this, don't want to do that. Let's cancel this. Yes, I want to cancel. Delete and close that. And then if we open up a new window, and then what do we want to do? We want to create one of these. So how do we do that? Let's try and break this down. So we want to alter the customers table. Okay, we're altering this table here. We're adding in the constraint. We have to give the constraint a name, right? I'll make this bigger so we can see. So we're adding a constraint. We have to give that constraint a name. It's a unique name that we need to give it. A foreign key. So we want to reference that foreign key, which is obviously in the customers table. This is the foreign key, the gender's ID. And then we want it to reference the gender ID. Okay, so now if we create this, so if we see now that actual constraint has been created, so the command completed successfully. If we go down to the customers table, expand the customers table, and if we go to keys, expand keys, we can see now that we have the foreign key, which is FK_gender, has been created. If we now go to the table and say design, and then we go and see relationships, we can see that relationship is existing now in the actual graphical interface. That we could have created it in this way, but we created it using the query. So now we can see that. And if we go down to the ellipsis, we can see that relationship has now been created between the genders table and the customers table based on the ID and the genders ID. So if we go down and then now, if we go to edit top 200 rows, so let's import new data. So let's say, so in the customers table, we'll just say 1, and then we'll say Ali, and then we'll just give it a name, an email, ali@gm.com, and then we'll give it a gender ID of 1, which is perfectly acceptable. And the reason why we're getting a violation here is because we don't actually have a gender ID of 1. So if we try to do that again, it will say foreign key violation. There's a conflict between the database, the insert statement, because of the foreign key constraint FK_gender. Why is that? Is because in the genders table, we don't actually have any rows. So if we now say, right, in the genders table, let's add ID of 1, and then we'll say male, and then save that. Now, if we come to here and click OK, now that accepts it in the customers table because we have male in the genders table. So now if we don't actually have a female, we're going to get the same error. So if we say now 2, and then we'll say Sam, right, female name, and then we'll say Sam at ss.com, doesn't matter what we have. But now the genders ID, we're going to say 2. We're going to get a foreign key violation error message again because we don't actually have the number 2 that refers to the primary key from the genders table. Again, press enter, we're going to get that same foreign key violation because number 2 or female doesn't exist in the genders table. So this is how foreign key and primary keys work in terms of throwing up violations and maintaining something very specific when it comes to SQL Server or any data related. It's called data integrity. So we're maintaining the data integrity of those. Do we need to create and understand how we need to write some of these queries in terms of the, creating the constraints and so on? I don't think you do, because if you're doing SQL interviews and so on, no one's really going to ask you, can you tell me how you can create or add a constraint? You can Google this in 2 seconds and find many articles that will tell you. Most people will actually forget how to do even simple tasks and get reminded through just Googling and finding out how you can add a constraint onto a particular table. So I hope that's been useful in terms of understanding what a foreign key and a primary key relationship is between tables, but we will come on to how those are useful in certain things like joining tables where you would need a foreign key and a primary key relationship. So I hope that's been useful, and I will see you guys on the next video.